To find answers, you need to go back to the very beginning. Beneath this church in Rome lies an ancient catacomb. Here, the earliest persecuted Christians buried their dead in secret. It had started 34 years after Christ's death, when the Emperor Nero was looking for scapegoats for the Great Fire of Rome. He pointed the finger at the Christians, and at his word the killing began. Many believe that it's from this persecuted community that the very first gospel writer emerged sometime around 70 AD. Mark.
We don't know precisely who Mark is. He doesn't sort of sign his book at the end and say, this is where I've come from, this is who I am. But you can pick up clues from the gospel about who he is. It's quite possible that Mark, like many of the other Christians in this period, actually has personally experienced persecution. He's very realistic and gritty. You know, you can smell the dirt and the blood in Mark's gospel. In some ways it's because of the persecution that Mark wants to write the first gospel, because you've got to try and make sense of it. And what better way of making sense of it than telling the story of the first real martyr of this new faith, Jesus himself.
Mark may have known persecution, but what did he know firsthand about Jesus himself?
The thing is, when you're looking at the Gospels, we don't know it's true. There are no independent archaeological records where you can check things up. No one was out there with a camcorder, you know, recording these things. There wasn't even anyone taking notes, as far as we know. So a lot of it we're being asked to take on trust. I don't think Mark himself is an eyewitness. For a start, he never actually says, I did this, I did the other. So he's not even claiming to be an eyewitness. But what I think you do find in Mark's Gospel is some quite interesting reminiscences from some of the earliest people that were involved with Jesus himself. People like Peter, James and John, they've talked to people, and these oral traditions have found their way to Mark.
That the first gospel writer was relying on hearsay is a bit of a thunderbolt. Then you realise that lots of Jesus' story isn't even there in the earliest Mark manuscripts. No nativity, no long sermons, no resurrection appearances. In the end, it's less a record of events than a self-help guide that says suffering and persecution are the best way to God.
Mark is the creative genius that gets this whole process of writing Gospels going. In a way, it's quite an arrogant, quite a conceited thing to do, to say, I'm going to do an authoritative version of this story. It has a kind of propaganda purpose, I think.
Mark's big idea took off. A decade or more later, over in Antioch in Syria, another man turned his hand to writing Jesus' story. But this time, it's a PR campaign for a very different kind of Christ.
Well, most people might think first off that Matthew's Gospel is written by Matthew the tax collector, one of the 12 disciples. When you look at the document carefully, you see that the Gospel doesn't look like the product of an eyewitness. So who is this character? Well, the most important thing of all about Matthew is this is clearly a Jewish writer that knows all about the habits and the ways and the laws of Judaism.
Rather than go back to the drawing board, Matthew started by copying large chunks of Mark's Gospel, then rewriting or adding his own bits.
In the ancient world, there's no copyright laws, and you can just copy stuff out, and Matthew does. I mean, sometimes word for word.
Isn't this just plagiarism?
I think the thing is, you'd have to say that if Matthew was writing today, you could take him to court for plagiarism. There's no question about it. What Matthew, I think, is trying to do is supplant Mark. He's trying to take it over. Matthew thinks that Mark's picture of Jesus isn't quite right. He knows that Jesus was a Jew, and he knows that Jesus was more Jewish than Mark is inclined to paint him. So if you like, he goes through the process of almost re-Judaizing Jesus and making him more Jewish.
So Matthew adds the Christmas story, the Sermon on the Mount, and the Lord's Prayer, all pointing to Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. And this is probably why his book ends up with top billing in the New Testament. So is Matthew the first salesman of a Jewish Jesus?
I think so. I think one of the things he wants to do is he wants to make Jesus a son of Abraham, a son of David, paint him like Moses.
Most people read this gospel as history, but you're suggesting it's propaganda. How do you hold that together as a Christian?
I think the thing is, it's not a case of either or. It's not a case of just because something's got a bit of spin, just because something's trying to tell a particular story to a particular group of people, that it's not got any history in it.
By this point in the late 1st century AD, the tone's been set for the Gospels, and it was all about being a consummate spin doctor. Like Luke, an educated man based in Greece, Luke focuses on taking the Bible into the mainstream of the Roman Empire, writing not just the Gospel, but the book of Acts too, describing the spread of Christianity from Jerusalem to Rome.
Luke wants to tell the whole world this Christian religion is reputable, it's okay. He's trying to say, look, it might sound nutty, this stuff. It's about some Jewish carpenter in some backwater. But he's saying, no, Christianity is respectable. It is the kind of thing that a civilized, middle-class kind of Roman citizen like me can believe in. It's something which is right there at the heart of the empire. And Luke really paves the way for Christianity becoming a Roman imperial religion.
The spin of the last Gospel's the most obvious. It was written by a Jew called John, who's kicked out of the synagogue in Paul's old city, Ephesus, at the end of the 1st century. And by writing extra, slightly unreal speeches for Jesus, John's peddling a specific new angle. Why the need for a 4th Gospel?
Because John wrote a Gospel, we've got to assume that he must have been dissatisfied with the others in some way. I suspect that the thing that he didn't like about them was that they didn't quite get their vision of Jesus right. The Jesus in the other Gospels is not quite, if you like, divine enough.
So isn't he just rewriting history?
I think that the author of John's Gospel is definitely meditating on these events and thinking about them and kind of working them, rejigging them a little bit for his own time. I mean, is he actually, in some of these things, actually, if you like, making things up? Well, I think he would see it as being inspired by the Holy Spirit to put into writing some of these things that the other writers of the Gospels haven't actually got to the heart of.
This all seemed totally opposite to what I was brought up to believe as a kid, and what only the other day all those pilgrims I met in Jerusalem were counting on. So the question for me now as a believer is whether it discredits the Gospels if they're not just simple reportage. One of the things I've learned from being in Rome is that you can't read the Gospels literally. They're not meant to be read as eyewitness accounts. We don't know what really happened, but maybe we don't need to, because if we see these texts as an attempt by a community to work out what's happening in its life by reflecting on the life of Jesus, then we can see them as books of faith. They aim to communicate faith. So it seems to me, if you read the Gospels as straightforward historical fact, then it's just as dangerous as reading the Old Testament that way, because you're going to miss the point of what they're really about. So it's back to England to talk to a guy who's transformed himself from underworld villain to born-again Christian, simply by reading and believing the New Testament Gospels.
People seem to get a blinkered attitude that maybe Christians are a weak type of person and they're like a wimp and you're walking along with an old duffel coat and sandals and you won't say boot to a goose. Now, to me, the